The hearing on the Subcommittee on Health, Employment, Labor, and Pensions will come to order. I note that a quorum is present. Without objection, the chair is authorized to call a recess at any time. President Biden's radical labor policies have damaged fair and open labor relations between employers and employees and are fundamentally reshaping the labor landscape. Upon taking office, President Biden declared his intention to govern as the most pro-union president in history. Well, President Biden has kept his promise and proven to be the most partisan, big labor president since FDR. And the nation is worse off for it. Today, we will examine the three main ways in which unions have been emboldened under this president's leadership to pursue bad faith organizing tactics. First, unions conduct corporate campaigns to damage a company's image and reputation. Corporate campaigns often involve a range of disruptive attacks, such as frivolous legal challenges, political schemes, or public relations assaults. The goal is to force the company to surrender to union demands, regardless of whether those demands are in the best interest of the business or its employees. These corporate campaigns often lead to another tactic, so-called neutrality agreements. These agreements are often misrepresented as a peaceful way to allow unionization efforts to proceed without employer intervention. The reality is that these neutrality agreements can be coercive and undermine the rights of both employers and employees. They typically implement gag clauses, card check provisions, and force employers to give unions access to workers' private personal information. Finally, unions will install undercover assaults, which is when a union organizer covertly seeks employment at a company with the primary intention of organizing the workforce from the inside and filing frivolous unlabor practice charges against the employer. This is a highly disruptive scheme that harms the business, reduces productivity, and generates employer-employee conflict. These tactics do not align with the principles of a fair and open organizing process. The Biden administration's promotion of many of these unfair schemes are yet more examples of their efforts to facilitate power grabs by union bosses. Fortunately, President Biden's favorability is cratering with union households. The American people are seeing Biden's big labor bias for what it is, anti-worker and anti-business. In fact, polls show that union households have shifted 6 points towards President Trump since 2020. The American people understand that President Biden's economic policies actually harm working-class families. The biggest factor in raising workers' wages is a strong economy, like what we had under President Trump's leadership, not the hyperinflation-causing policies known as Bidenomics. Going forward, we should ensure that both employers and employees can express their views openly and honestly in a labor dispute and allow any negotiations to be conducted in good faith, absent union intimidation. With that, I yield to the ranking member for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to the witnesses. I'm tempted to quote Ronald Reagan, there you go again. Trickle down will work for everybody, just trust us. But I guess I did do that. I apologize. But I wish we could focus on a strong economy where it benefits everybody. It's pretty clear that when workers have a voice, whether they be unionized or not, and clear to me that the union movement helps union members and non-union members to have that voice at a time where we're at the highest level of inequality in the history of this country, where the average union worker's hourly wage is about $23 an hour, but the average wage of the Fortune SP 500 corporations is almost $9,000 an hour. In 1965, when union membership was at its highest and our economy was amongst the best it's ever been in history, there was a clear correlation between the pay for CEOs and their workforce. It's now only almost 400 times the average worker. In those days, it was 3 times. So something is amiss. I'm for fair organizing, legal organizing, and I think the vast majority of the people in the union movement do that. If they can talk honestly to their members or their prospective members, then we can have a fair conversation. And high road employers realize that. They realize their workforce is the essence of their success. And I knew that when I was a small business owner. And I had been a union member before I was a restaurant owner. I understand the importance of the relationship between the workforce and the profitability of a business, whether it be small or S&P 100. I believe both can prosper. As a matter of fact, I think both must prosper in the United States of America for it to work for everyone. The folks who make this country work are the folks that are asked to defend this country in its moment of need through history. If they don't feel part of the overall e pluribus unum, out of many one, then it doesn't work, and that's what's happening right now. And that's what President Biden and we are attempting to do. Given the title of this hearing and the chairman's opening statement, it feels that this is designed to be another in a series of hearings undermining workers' right to organize and collectively bargaining, not making sure that the rules are clear to both parties and that they both adhere to them. Let's make one thing clear: workers are their union. When my colleagues and their large corporate allies attack unions, they are attacking workers who are seeking a better life and want to achieve the American dream. They are attacking people like Priscilla, a union cook in San Francisco. After joining Unite Here, Local 2, of which many years ago I was a member of, Priscilla and her co-workers' collective action helped them win family health care. She also won job security. Priscilla says, "My union contract gives me a sense of security that I'm always going to be able to provide for my family." It's not just Priscilla who benefits through her union. Research consistently shows that when workers band together to have a voice and exercise their right to organize, they have higher pay, better benefits, and safer workplaces. And research also shows that non-union workers benefit from it as well. In fact, the average median union worker is paid approximately 20% more than the median non-union worker. And in the private sector, union workers are 26% more likely to be offered health insurance through work, 12 to 15% more likely to have paid leave, and 53% more likely to have defined pension plans, benefit pension plans. Unions also help grow the economy from the bottom up and the middle out and increase economic mobility for historically underserved and overlooked communities. As we fight for the equity and justice in the workplace, unions uplift workers' voices and push for better, safer working conditions. Unfortunately today, right-wing billionaires just can't get enough. They've funded organizations, and Republicans are attempting to weaken workers' rights to organize and collectively bargain through anti-worker legislation. Not only is the majority fighting to gut workers' rights and ability to win a strong contract, they also want to tie the hands of employers who voluntarily choose neutrality and respect their workers' choice on union representation. Companies like Microsoft and Epoch Systems recognize that you don't have to fight your workers tooth and nail. The Vice President and Deputy General Counsel of Microsoft said its neutrality agreement with the Communications Workers of America, quote, reduced friction, it built relationships with our workers, end quote. She even recommended other businesses rethink neutrality agreements and respect workers' choice. For all the majority's talk of restrictions on employers, they are now meddling with an employer's ability to facilitate a positive relationship with organized workers. For the employers who want to be high road employers. The focus of this hearing also completely ignores the primary obstacle that workers face in exercising their freedom of association: aggressive and pervasive union busting. The reality is that many unscrupulous employers, not all, not the high road employers like Microsoft, are threatening, surveilling, and firing workers for their union interest and activity without any meaningful repercussions because of the lack of civil penalties on the law and the severely underfunded National Labor Relations Board. The Biden administration has made significant progress towards cracking down on dishonest employers and supporting workers' right to organize and respecting high road employers. However, we still have a long way to go. That is why we must work together to pass the Protecting the Right to Organize Act, or the PRO Act. I'm proud to join Ranking Member Scott, Representative Brian Fitzpatrick, in reintroducing this landmark proposal from last year. The bipartisan PRO Act would rectify the weaknesses in the NLRA and level the playing field in the workplace by strengthening, not weakening workers' basic right to join or form a union and holding unscrupulous employers accountable. Labor unions have always led the fight towards many of the critical advances in today's workplace, and we will continue to guide workers to securing higher wages, better benefits, and safer workplaces. What's more, unions create workplace democracies. This is a choice, so that workers have real voice in their conditions. An attack on labor unions is an attack on workers and their families. We should keep that front and center during this morning's hearing. Thank you for your time, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Saulnier. Pursuant to committee rules, 8C, all members who wish to insert written statements into the record may do so by submitting them to the committee clerk electronically in Microsoft Word format by 5:00 p.m., 14 days after the date of this hearing, which is June 5, 2024. Without objection, the hearing record will remain open for 14 days to allow such statements and other extraneous materials referenced during the hearing to be submitted for the official hearing record. We'll now turn to the introduction of our distinguished witnesses. And our first witness is Mr. William Messenger, who's the Vice President and Legal Director for the National Right to Work Legal Defense Foundation, located in Springfield, Virginia. Welcome, sir. Our next witness is Mr. Michael Alcorn, who's a crew member for Trader Joe's in Hatfield, Massachusetts. Welcome. Our third witness is Ms. Lynn Rhinehart, who's a Senior Fellow at the Economic Policy Institute in Washington, D.C. Welcome. And our final witness is Mr. Stephen Delie, who is the Director of Labor Policy for the Mackinac Center for Public Policy in Midland, Michigan. Welcome, sir. We thank the witnesses for being here today, and we look forward to your testimony. Pursuant to committee rules, we would ask that you limit your oral presentation to a 5-minute summary of your written statement. And we'd also like to remind the witnesses to be aware of their responsibility to provide accurate information to the subcommittee. And I will now recognize Mr. Messenger for 5 minutes.
Chairman Good, Ranking Member Saulnier, members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. The point of my testimony is straightforward. Secret ballot elections and free speech are far superior to card checks and censorship. But before discussing that point, I wanted to note that an individual's right to choose whether to associate with a union shouldn't be put to a majority vote at all, regardless of the process. The First Amendment guarantees to every person an individual right to choose what organization he or she affiliates with. We don't put to a vote what church people must belong to, what political party they must affiliate with, what advocacy group they must be a part of. It's an individual choice. That same principle should apply to unions. Whether any worker associates with a union should be that individual's choice and not a collective decision. Unfortunately, federal law collectivizes that decision. Federal labor law provides that workers must accept union representation if, at some moment in the past, even if decades ago, a majority of workers in the workplace supposedly supported the union. And what's more, federal law authorizes forcing workers to pay dues to that union even if they don't want to be a member. I submit this is inconsistent with basic precepts of free association. And at the very least, Congress should pass the National Right to Work Act and guarantee that every worker at least has the freedom not to be forced to pay dues to a union to keep their jobs. However, if the government is going to persist with its collectivist approach, at the very least it can provide workers with a democratic process for choosing or rejecting a union. And at a minimum, this means secret ballot elections and free speech. Secret ballot elections and free speech are the backbone of our political process and the political process of any nation that could call itself a democracy. With a secret ballot, voters can vote their conscience without worrying about intimidation or threats. With free flow of information, they can make an informed decision. Unfortunately, union organizers often attempt to rob employees of their right to vote in a secret ballot and of their right to free speech with union organizing agreements. And in these agreements, try to supplant that process with card check and with censorship of employer speech about unionization. And I submit that's nothing like a democratic process. I mean, just imagine if the ruling party of a third world nation decided to use such a process instead of having secret ballot elections for political office. Instead of having elections, the ruling party would go around to people's homes and workplaces and collect votes for the party. Instead of free speech, only the ruling party would be allowed to campaign. Campaigning by the opposition party would be banned. And if and when the ruling party collects a majority of votes from the citizens, the ruling party is declared the winner in perpetuity and does not have to stand for re-election. That's very similar to what employees face under union organizing agreements. Union organizing agreements generally supplant secret ballot elections with card check recognition, where union organizers go to employees' homes and into their workplaces to collect votes for the union, mainly by getting them to sign union membership cards. Union organizing agreements almost always contain gag clauses that censor the employer from speaking about unionization, therefore ensuring that employees only hear one side of the story. That's spun by the union. And if and when the union collects cards from a majority of employees, it presumptively becomes the employee's representative forever, because nothing in the National Labor Relations Act requires that unions stand for re-election. I submit this process is nothing akin to a democratic process that would be allowed in any sort of political democracy. And unfortunately, the Biden National Labor Relations Board is getting into the act and also trying to repress secret ballot elections and free speech, even though the NLRA favors both. The National Labor Relations Act favors secret ballot elections and does not mandate card check. And in fact, Congress, you've repeatedly refused to amend the National Labor Relations Act with the PRO Act and other things to mandate card check. Yet the Biden NLRB is trying to do an end run around Congress by mandating card check with its CEMEX decision, under which it's now an unfair labor practice, according to the Biden board, for an employer to refuse to recognize a union based on cards. Turning to free speech, the Supreme Court has recognized that the National Labor Relations Act favors a robust, open, and wide open debate about labor disputes, and that employees have an implicit right to receive information about unionization. But notwithstanding what the National Labor Relations Act is supposed to do, the Biden NLRB is cracking down on employer speech as much as it can and trying to suppress any speech that it deems critical of unions and of unionization. I submit this is wrongful. The American workers deserve secret ballot elections and free speech, not card checks and censorship. Congress can make that a reality in a variety of ways. There's several bills pending. And in fact, the National Labor Relations Board could go a long way to fostering elections and free speech if only it would stop trying to throttle both and enforce existing law against union organizing agreements. I submit the board should try to be part of the solution instead of be part of the problem. Thank you, Chairman Good, and I look forward to answering everyone's questions.
Thank you. We'll now recognize Mr. Alcorn for 5 minutes.
My name is Michael Alcorn. I've been a crew member at Trader Joe's for nearly 10 years. Thank you for allowing me to share my experiences with the Trader Joe's United Union at my store in Hadley, Massachusetts. Prior to the campaign, I had no firsthand experience with unions. My only thought on unions was that they looked like a positive unifying force. The realities I experienced both during and since the union campaign were not positive nor unifying. From the beginning of the campaign, everything was very one-sided.
Pardon me, I'm going to ask you to pull that microphone a little bit closer to you so we can hear you better. If you would. Bring it right up. Can you? Yeah, we're having trouble hearing you there.
Should I start again, or?
Yeah, let's restart the clock and let him go again, please.
Okay, thank you so much.
From the top.
My name is Michael Alcorn. I've been a crew member at Trader Joe's for nearly 10 years. Thank you for allowing me to share my experiences with the Trader Joe's United Union at my store in Hadley, Massachusetts. Prior to the campaign, I had no firsthand experience with unions. My only thought on unions was that they looked like a positive unifying force. The realities I experienced both during and since the union campaign were not positive nor unifying. From the beginning of the campaign, everything was very one-sided. The organizers used with us or against us tactics that did not promote all voices, but only the union position. I first heard about the unionization efforts from a coworker in May of 2022. They told me our conversation must be kept confidential or people might get fired. I responded that I didn't think we needed a union, but I'd be willing to talk about it. The organizer then told me that all we need to initiate a union election was for 30% of the store to say they'd be willing to have a union election, and then we could talk about it. I stated that I would support an election because I thought that there would be some sort of a meeting where we would all get together and discuss this. That never happened. A few days later, the organizers petitioned for an election, claiming they had majority support and that Trader Joe's should recognize this union without a vote. This would have forced many of my coworkers into a unionized environment without any prior knowledge or the ability to be a part of making that decision. I was lied to by the organizer. They misrepresented what was really needed in order to have a union election, which is 30% support for a union, not an election. To this day, I wonder how many of my coworkers might have gotten the same deceptive pitch and signed union cards. The day the petition was filed, the organizers made inaccurate and incomplete press releases, creating false narratives about our workplace to promote their own agenda and personal vendettas. We did not appreciate these few coworkers portraying our workplace in a negative light. It was extremely disheartening and embarrassing. Our customers were supportive of our rights to organize, which we appreciated, but we wanted them to know that the union campaign was not representative of all of us. I asked the organizer why they didn't come speak to all of us about our experiences before putting out a one-sided video. They said they had to do it this way and that you have to surprise the boss when organizing a union. This really upsets me because up to this point I worked in a positive, civil, and respectful workplace. It wasn't just surprise the boss, it was organize in secret and surprise your coworkers, and then make them feel like if they don't vote for the union, they don't care about their coworkers. When some of us attended an informational gathering hosted by the organizers to ask questions, we were promptly called anti-union. Some coworkers were told that they might be racist if they don't vote for the union. It became clear that not only was the union going to attack Trader Joe's, they were attacking the credibility of any member of the collective in opposition to unionization. Anyone speaking up was smeared by the organizers as moles for the company, incapable of having any credible concerns or independent agency. After an organizer realized I wasn't on board, they told me that they couldn't answer any more of my questions because they needed to focus on the people who would help them win. I called the NLRB, expecting them to be able to offer some advice and to see if the organizers had any duty to disclose information that would be relevant to their representing me should they win. The NLRB agents told me that it makes sense that the organizers would only talk to the people who already support the union. Anyone voicing any concern was essentially excommunicated. We were made to feel as if we would not be represented if we were not on board before the vote. Many of us were devastated when the union won. People who were against the union were harassed in the parking lot after the results were announced. Shortly thereafter, with only selective notification, the union held an officer election. Only a quarter of the collective were present. Of those, a few handful voiced their concerns, having an election without notifying everyone. The union proceeded anyways. I was later told by a coworker that one of the organizers told them they purposefully didn't advertise the election so that they could get the right people in. When I spoke to the Department of Labor, I was told that while they do have strict rules to guarantee fairness in union elections, they could not guarantee fairness in this election because it was a new union. In my research, I couldn't find any oversight as to how a union creates a constitution, so it seems as if the union can elect whomever they want, however they want, and create the law and power structure of the union without the consent or even knowledge of the collective. All the intimidation and pressure has been a lot for us to take. We've begun to collect signatures to decertify this union. They've done nothing but be adversarial, misleading, exclusive, and discriminate against anyone who challenges or disagrees with them. It seems their only tactic is to paint Trader Joe's as a bad company while also seeking to silence those of us who don't agree. Supporting workers should mean supporting all workers, not just pro-union workers. Workers should never have representation imposed upon them. Not all unions are good. We are not dumb, and Trader Joe's didn't union bust us not to vote for this union. This was a bad faith union. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll now recognize Ms. Rhinehart for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Good morning, Chairman Good, Ranking Member DeSaulnier, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for inviting me to testify today. My name is Lynn Rhinehart. I'm a senior fellow at the Economic Policy Institute, which is a nonprofit think tank here in Washington, D.C., that focuses on economic issues as they affect working people. This hearing is taking place at an exciting time. Workers are organizing at their workplaces at levels we haven't seen in years. Support for unions is at its highest in decades, particularly among young workers. Union membership has increased in each of the last 2 years. Workers are filing more petitions for union elections and are winning a higher percentage of elections. They're seeing the gains that unionized workers have won at the bargaining table, such as higher wages, an end to two-tier wages, and more, and workers are taking action to win these same sorts of improvements at their own workplaces. Research tells us that tens of millions of workers would choose union representation today if they had the chance. Unfortunately, our labor law is stacked against them because it gives employers too much leeway to interfere when workers try to organize, and there are literally no monetary penalties for going over the line and breaking the law. 2 recent union election campaigns help illustrate my point. Last Saturday, the National Labor Relations Board announced that 1,700 workers at Disneyland, who work as costumed characters like Mickey Mouse and Donald Duck, voted overwhelmingly to unionize with Actors' Equity. Disney has a long history of working with unions. It's my understanding that Disney did not run a campaign against the union, but left the choice to workers, who voted overwhelmingly to unionize. Leaders of the organizing drive said it was a win-win situation. They said, quote, "You can be pro-Disney and pro-union at the same time." The day before, the NLRB announced that workers at 2 Mercedes plants in Alabama had voted against unionizing with the United Auto Workers. Unlike Disney, Mercedes, which has a long history of working with unions in Europe, reportedly engaged in an intense anti-union campaign with daily anti-union messages, regular anti-union captive audience meetings, firing and retaliating against union supporters, and more. These campaigns wear workers down, as one worker was quoted as saying, quote, "Everyone is just sick and tired of it." Mercedes' conduct is being investigated by the German government for violating German law, and charges have been filed alleging that Mercedes violated US labor law. But if the NLRB finds that Mercedes crossed the line and illegally interfered with their workers' organizing rights, Mercedes will face no monetary penalties under US law. None. There has been a lot of talk today about employee free choice and the suggestion that an NLRB election is the best or perhaps only way to assure employee free choice about whether to unionize. But under our law, the NLRB election process does not necessarily provide a fair choice because of the employer anti-union campaigns leading up to the election that our law allows. Imagine an election for public office when only one party had direct access to the electorate and could communicate with the electorate every day leading up to the election on work time about their preferred candidate, while the other candidate was relegated to talking with voters in the parking lot or on the street while voters were leaving their shifts and trying to get home or trying to get to work on time. That's hardly fair, but that's our system. And then there's the subtle or not so subtle pressure about how things will get worse if workers choose to unionize. These employer campaigns are incredibly powerful and effective, and employers know this. Because the bottom line is that workers don't want a fight with their employer. They want a union and a collective voice to make their jobs better. That's why we should support employers and unions coming together to reach agreements on how organizing campaigns will be handled. There's nothing improper about these agreements. They lower the temperature, establish basic ground rules, and in so doing, they actually facilitate employees having a free choice about unionizing, which is everybody's goal and is what our law is supposed to protect. We should support these agreements, not criminalize them, as one of the bills being discussed today would do. In sum, workers want unions. Unions help all workers, both union and non-union, in winning better pay, benefits, and fairness on the job. We all saw the UAW bump, the pay raises that non-union auto plants gave their workers after the UAW's historic contracts last fall. We should be focused on ways to make it easier, not harder, for workers to exercise their rights to form and join unions. Passing the Protecting the Right to Organize Act and the Public Service Freedom to Negotiate Act would be a great place to start. Thank you, and I'd be happy to answer your questions.
Thank you. We'll now recognize our final witness, Mr. Delie, for 5 minutes.
Chairman Good, Ranking Member Delie, and members of the subcommittee, good morning and thank you for having me. My name is Steve Delie, and I'm Director of Labor Policy for the Mackinac Center, a 501c3 research and educational organization that advances the cause of free markets and limited government. I'm here today to support policies that will better enable workers to make a free choice about unionization in the workplace. These policies are necessary because the current administration, including the National Labor Relations Board under Chairman Lauren McFerrin, have encouraged the adoptions of policies that favor unions over workers. Today, I would like to discuss those policies, as well as 3 bills that advance the cause of worker freedom, namely the Employee Rights Act, the Workers' Choice Act, and the Start Applying Labor Transparency Act. For decades, unions have been aggressively pursuing an organizing strategy based on a process known as card check, which is an alternative to the traditional secret ballot election. Secret ballot elections are the gold standard for unionization determinations, and both the NLRB and courts have recognized as such. Despite this, unions have aggressively pushed for card check. Card check occurs in public, which itself puts undue pressure on employees. While this pressure alone is a problem, a far more troubling issue is that card check campaigns open the door to deception and coercion. Past union tactics have included threats of violence, deportation, and even lying about the effect of signing a card. Whether it be through deception, coercion, or pressure, card check campaigns necessarily distort employees' true opinions about unionization. One technique unions use to avoid secret ballot elections is to convince or to coerce employers into entering into so-called neutrality agreements. Although styled as an agreement by an employer to maintain neutrality throughout a unionization campaign, These agreements silence employers and deprive employees from hearing all of the facts regarding unionization. To obtain neutrality agreements, unions often turn to a tool known as a corporate campaign. A corporate campaign occurs when a union attempts to accomplish labor goals through economic or legal pressure. In some cases, corporate campaigns have even caused businesses to close entirely, an outcome that has been praised by union organizers. Shutting down a business as a message to other non-union businesses might be a win for unions, but it does little to help the workers who end up unemployed. Another example of the unfair playing field in labor law is known as salting. Salting is the union practice of hiring workers to create discontent amongst employees while encouraging unionization. And while employers are required to file detailed reports on their consultants, unions are not. Congress should level the playing field. Workers' rights to a fair election are under threat. The most significant legislative threat to the secret ballot is the PRO Act. Under the PRO Act, employers accused of interfering in an election must prove their innocence or risk being ordered to bargain based on card check. This is particularly problematic thanks to the NRB's recent decision in Cemex. The ongoing attacks against workers' rights to a free and fair election have not gone unnoticed. Ongoing efforts at both the federal and state levels are advancing the cause of worker freedom. At the federal level, the Employee Rights Act, the Workers' Choice Act, and the SALT Act are all meaningful steps towards ensuring workers have a free and fair choice about unionization. While the ERA advances several policies, the most relevant to my testimony today is its guarantee of a secret ballot election. The Workers' Choice Act ensures that workers opting out of union membership have the chance to represent themselves in employment matters. The SALT Act, meanwhile, ensures that unions and employers are treated equally. I urge the passage of all three acts, which, together, will eliminate many of the concerns that I've identified today. The states have also recognized the importance of ensuring workers can make a fully informed choice about unionization. In 2023, Tennessee became the first state in the nation to adopt a law requiring secret ballot elections as a condition of economic development funding, with both Georgia and Alabama quickly following suit. These states are at the forefront of pushing back against federal overreach and are ensuring workers can make a fully informed decision about unionization. Congress should heed this growing chorus of state voices and enact common sense reforms to protect workers. The Employee Rights Act, Workers' Choice Act, and SALT Act are all significant steps in the right direction and should be adopted. But Congress can and should go further and ensure that labor law as a whole is premised on the principle of truly voluntary association. I thank you for the opportunity to testify before you today, and I look forward to answering your questions.
I want to thank our witnesses. Under Rule 9, we will now question witnesses under the 5-minute rule. I will wait to ask my questions later. First, I'd like to recognize Mr. Wahlberg from Michigan for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank the panel for being here today. This is an important topic, and it goes around and around and around. It comes back, goes forward, comes back. Nonetheless, good to have you here today. The National Labor Relations Act was created by Congress to provide a level playing field between employers and union leaders, but most importantly, it was designed to protect the right of work-free and informed decisions about whether they want to join a union. Unfortunately, as Mr. Alcorn stated so clearly in his testimony, there are cases where information is being misrepresented and workers are being deceived during a unionization drive. So I appreciate the committee holding this hearing today to discuss tactics that sometimes go against democracy in the workplace very clearly. Mr. Delie, thanks for being here. Sure appreciate the Mackinac Center over the years, many years now, that I've been affiliated with your positions, sometimes positions that go against my party's policy. But you've taken a strong stance on the issue of law and policy that works within our Constitution. As you state in your testimony, secret ballot elections are the gold standard for unionization determinations. I agree, and as we all know in Congress, the higher the voter participation, the better. What I am concerned about is data showing that in multiple union elections, less than a majority of employees participated. Specifically, in 2023, there were 146 elections in which less than a majority participated, and 44 elections in which less than 1/3 of the employees participated. This is concerning because in these cases, a small minority of workers determine workplace representation. which may not reflect the true wishes of the majority of workers. Mr. Delie, does the National Labor Relations Board require a certain percentage of employees to participate in an election?
Generally speaking, no, Representative. The National Labor Relations Act says that the elections have to be conducted by a majority of employees in the unit, but that definition has been stretched over the years, and I can give you an example. Most recently, in Riverside, California, there was an election at a Starbucks franchise. That election was won by the union with 11% support. There were 28 workers at that franchise. 3 voted in favor, 1 opposed, 24 abstained, and that union stands a good chance of being recognized anyway. So we've gotten away from a point where at least a quorum of employees even are voting on this issue.
Okay. Does the current National Labor Relations Board have policies to incentivize high voter participation among a potential bargaining unit, Mr. Delie?
Yes, they do. So for the past several years, the NLRB has been advancing both mail-in ballots and more recently electronic ballots. And this is despite the fact that statistics have shown that these reduce voter turnout relatively significantly. In Asperius and Keweenaw, which is a 2020 NLRB decision, even the NLRB recognized that those statistics show that when you do remote voting, you lose out on a lot of the participation. So by encouraging that, you're discouraging a truly representative election.
And then finally, what benefits do you think could be gained by having a minimum threshold for participation in representation elections?
Well, I think that would be very consistent with the original purpose of the Act. I mean, when you're talking about unionization, it's supposed to be representative of the will of the majority of employees of a workplace. Well, if you have an extreme minority voting and making the determination for the majority, you lose out on that level of democratic support. So I think at the very least, a quorum of employees should be necessary in order to have a union recognized.
Thank you. Mr. Alcorn, thank you for being here. You mentioned in your testimony you tried to get basic pros and cons, both sides of the issue on unionizing Trader Joe's. How did Trader Joe's United organizers react to Trader Joe's crew members requesting information about the union?
As I stated in my testimony, they were pretty dismissive of us and were trying to silence our questioning as soon as they could, which is why I felt the need to call the NLRB, because I didn't really know what our rights were in this moment. They seemed to also intimidate our workplace into making us feel like we couldn't even discuss these issues with our mates in the store. And we have really good relationships in the Trader Joe's. It's a different setup than maybe other workplaces. And so it was really hard for us not to be able to have those conversations with our mates.
Yeah, thank you. I hope in future your experience changes.
Thank you.
In a proper way. I yield back.
The gentleman from Michigan yields. I now recognize the ranking member for the purpose of questioning the witnesses. Oh, Ms. McBath, excuse me. Ms. McBath from Georgia, I now recognize you for the purpose of questioning the witnesses.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Ranking Member DeSaulnier and your staff, and to our witnesses. Thank you so much for being with us today. This is the 5th anti-union and anti-worker hearing that the majority has held this Congress. And it's no coincidence that these are coming at a time when unions are successfully organizing and negotiating in some of the most difficult places in the country. And instead of addressing the working conditions and the wages that are driving this wave, my colleagues would rather change the rules now that they feel that they aren't getting their desired effect of suppressing union membership. Regardless of what you may hear from my Republican colleagues today, the deck is stacked against unions and working families. And to say otherwise is to undermine American workers and their families in favor of companies that time and time again violate federal labor laws. The stakes in these negotiations are not even. When a store is closed due to shutdown attempts to organize, or workers illegally fired for exercising their right to organize, they lose their livelihood. They wrongfully lose their ability to provide for themselves and their families for weeks, for months, or sometimes even a year at a time. Even if the National Labor Relations Board comes back in a few months with a finding that the company did indeed violate the workers' rights, the paychecks have simply stopped. Their kids still need to eat, their lights must still stay on, and their rent is still due. Despite violating the law, the company has removed a worker who was legally just simply exercising their rights in the workplace, all at zero cost to the employer. The stakes are far higher for workers and their unions. These families live under the very real threat that their employer could simply shut down the store or fire them just simply on a whim. They are held to the expectation that they will still have to do their best work with that knowledge, while they wait and hope that they have enough money saved up to hold themselves over until they can find another job. Companies can move on like nothing happened while workers lose their main source of income and face life-altering consequences for themselves and for their families. These are entirely different levels of impact that we're talking about here this morning. These misguided attacks on unions and working families are simply wrong. Instead of changing the rules to make it harder for workers to organize, we should be doing what we can to ensure that every American worker can exercise their right in the workplace without fear of being wrongly terminated. Ms. Rhinehart, can you use what time that we have left remaining in my 5 minutes to discuss how important it is that we fully fund the National Labor Relations Board? Thank you.
Thank you for your statement and for that question. It's essential that the National Labor Relations Board be fully funded, which it is not currently. It's very underfunded relative to the task at hand. The National Labor Relations Board is responsible for protecting the organizing rights of 100 million workers, and they receive about $300 million a year. And it's been flat funded for a very long time, except for an increase a couple of years ago. And what this means is that the National Labor Relations Board, particularly in the regions, is very understaffed, the workload is very high, and case processing is very slow. So to the example that you provided in your comments about a worker being illegally fired for being pro-union and trying to organize a union at their workplace, the investigation of that charge is slow. The NLRB's action to try to seek recourse for that worker is slow because they simply don't have the resources that they need to move cases promptly and efficiently. It's truly a case of justice delayed is justice denied. And the last thing I would say on that is that under the National Labor Relations Act, unlike many other labor and employment laws, workers don't have a right to bring their case forward on their own. They are completely dependent on the National Labor Relations Board bringing their case on their behalf. So if the board is underfunded and they can't move the case, then the worker is really out of luck, which is a terrible situation for workers to find themselves in. Thank you.
Thank you, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentle lady from Georgia yields, and now I recognize myself for 5 minutes for questions. My home state of Georgia has been named the best state to do business in some 10 years in a row. We are a right-to-work state, which, Mr. Alcorn, that means that if you have a good job and you want to keep that job, that you do not have to pay union dues to keep that job. What this administration is attempting to do and has been attempting to do, along with every Democratic administration, is to apply the PRO Act throughout the entire country, which means that Georgia would no longer be able to have a right-to-work law. The modern workforce is entrepreneurial, and employees are competing for this modern workforce are very innovative in their approach to recruit and retain top talent. Mr. Delie, today's discussion has focused on the tactics that unions use to undermine workers' rights to a secret ballot and limit free speech during the unionization process. My bill, the Employee Rights Act, contains several provisions that promote free and fair union elections, including guaranteeing secret ballot elections. Can you discuss how the Employee Rights Act helps protect workers from coercive union tactics?
Yes, Representative, and first of all, thank you for your leadership on that bill. As you mentioned, one key provision of the Employee Rights Act is the protection of the secret ballot, which, as I said earlier, is the gold standard for union elections. It allows workers to make their choice outside of the public eye, free from any potential coercion or intimidation. But the Employee Rights Act goes further than that. It also requires workers to opt into any union political spending. So right now, workers who are hoping to opt out of that have to go through a somewhat arcane process to exercise a right under a case called Communication Workers v. Beck, whereas an opt-in system would remove that burden from workers, but still allow workers who support union political activity to spend as they so choose. It also enshrines the independent contractor standard. That would be a much more clear standard. Our current independent contractor standard is relatively subjective and murky, which is very difficult for, as you put it, entrepreneurs and small businesses to be able to comply with. It also clarifies a joint employer standard to ensure that when a unionization election happens at a franchise level, it's a truly representative local decision as opposed to a top-down approach adopted by the overarching franchisor.
In addition, my bill, the Truth Employment Act, ensures employers are not required to hire salts who enter the hiring process for the purpose of unionizing a workplace or to put the non-union company out of business. These salts are paid union agents and have no obligation to disclose their union affiliation with their employer or coworkers. In contrast, if an employer hires a consultant to discuss the impacts of unionization with workers, the employer must disclose his or her identity, compensation, and activities. The consultant is also required to disclose similar information. Your written testimony mentions recent polling on the subject of union salts. Can you discuss the results?
Yes, I can. So this poll was conducted, I believe, in 2022, and it talked, or 2023 actually, and it requested public feedback on salting. What it found is that 75% of those who were polled wanted equal disclosure from employer and unions on salting. 59% thought that elections featuring union salt should be thrown out entirely, and 62% thought that employers should be able to ask in a job interview if an applicant was a salt. So the bottom line is the polling showed that the public overwhelmingly favors an organic, free choice over a manipulated or manufactured one.
Yep, and again, I've said it over and over again, the American people just want choice here and not to be forced. Mr. Alcorn, to follow up on that response, do you believe salting is deceptive, and what is your opinion of this practice?
Yes, I do believe it's very deceptive. I think there's no question about that. I think if people want to organize, they should do it in an official capacity, not in a deceptive or secretive way. I think workers deserve to know who they're working with and what their intentions are. That's workers' rights.
I want to thank you, and to reiterate, my Employee Rights Act provides essential protections for workers' rights, choices, and freedoms, including ensuring political and privacy protections and guaranteeing secret ballot elections. And with that, we will recognize Mr. Norcross for 5 minutes for questioning.
Thank you, Chairman. And now the other side of the coin. First of all, thanks for having a hearing. I'm not sure the name of the hearing is completely accurate or what's reflective of what I call the real world and most Americans' real world, but I get it. Listen, it's getting close to election time for a lot of folks, and they're certainly going to say whatever they need. And that's what it's interesting. We talk about SALT and the ability that we have to be truthful and disclose. Wow. Take the presidential race and then let's have that conversation, huh? We have to be truthful and not deceptive. That somehow the elections for a union, there are not enough people voting. Well, not enough people voting and not a majority for a union election, yet we have a president who not only didn't get the majority of the people, didn't even get the majority of the vote, yet he's our president. But that's different over there. Union elections have to be different. Listen, if you want to do real polling, you go to the numbers of people, workers who want a union, overwhelmingly approaching 70%. If you go down the line here today, less than 0.5% would know what a SALT is. That's the reality of what's going on. What is going on is people just want to have a voice in their workplace. They're not out to bankrupt people. We can each pick out anecdotes on what's going on, this horrible issue, but the vast majority of people just want to have a say in their workplace. And that's an issue. So when we look at the issues around SALT, they're volunteers, the vast majority of them. Just people like you and I who want to go in and be treated fairly. And that sort of leads me to my first question is how can you explain to this committee, and this is from Ms. Rhinehart, salting, just like workers' union, is not aimed at hurting employers, and it's not. I was a SALT. I'm not sure anybody else in this room can say that. I was a SALT before they even called them SALTs. But talk about that. Their cause, their purpose is not to hurt an employer and put them out of business, but just to have a voice. Could you elaborate on that, Ms. Rhinehart?
I'd be happy to, thank you. That's exactly right. People hire on as SALTs to organize a workplace, not to damage a business. Damaging a business does no good to the business or the workers at the business who want the business to succeed, to continue to be employed, to hopefully have the business make a profit so that maybe they can share in some of that profit. So I really think that it's a false premise that the reason SALTs go into a workplace is to damage the business. SALTs go into the workplace to talk to workers about the idea of unionizing and improving their lives through having a collective voice. And the other thing I'd like to mention about SALTs is that to the extent a SALT is employed by a labor organization, that is disclosed currently under the very extensive financial reports that unions are required to file now and have been required to file for years under the Labor Management Reporting and Disclosure Act. These are very detailed reports, and every employee and their salary and their name is disclosed in these reports that are filed today. So there's a great deal of disclosure that already goes on. Legislation to require more disclosure really isn't needed. The last thing I'd like to say on the topic of salting is that one of the bills that's being discussed would actually legalize discrimination against workers for being pro-union. That's what legislation allowing employers not to hire SALTs would be, is legalizing discrimination against people because they're pro-union. And that just completely undermines the premise of our labor law, which is that workers ought to have a free and fair choice to be pro-union and to organize their workplace. So I hope that's responsive to your question.
Well, it does, and it doesn't change having a SALT that is involved in no way impacts or changes whether or not an employee would vote for a union or not vote.
Exactly, and I think that's another really important thing to bear in mind. An employee in the workplace who's a SALT and pro-union gets one vote.
That's it.
Other workers get one vote. The SALT does not vote for other workers, so it's one vote. It's one person, one vote.
So when I was unemployed and was an electrician, we were between jobs. There was a contractor who I know was interested, their employees, in being union. I went down and applied for a job. That ended up creating the beginning. Not only did that employer voluntarily sign with our union, but I ended up a 30-year relationship with that employer that salted from the very beginning. It's not to put them out of business, it's to bring us all together. And with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. We'll now recognize Dr. Fox for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank our witnesses for being here today. Mr. Messenger, in your written testimony, you discussed the differences between the traditional or bottom-up organizing process and top-down organizing tactics. Can you discuss how top-down union organizing tactics undermine an atmosphere of free and open debate leading up to a union election?
Thank you for the question, Dr. Fox. The simple answer is that one of the aims of almost any top-down organizing campaign is what unions euphemistically call a neutrality agreement. But the key to neutrality is a gag clause on employer speech. And so the result is, in any kind of organizing campaign, only the union can campaign. Only the union can put out its information. The employer's speech about the downsides of unionization, what may happen, is completely censored by that gag clause as a result of top-down organizing. And so as a result, most employees don't have information on both sides of the story when they're making a decision. And of course, under most neutrality agreements, they're not making that decision at all in the privacy of a voting booth, but rather doing so in the teeth of a union card check campaign.
It's very important that they understand both sides. Mr. Alcorn, during the Trader Joe's United campaign to organize your workplace, the union promised to be an independent union powered by crew members. Do you believe the union's leadership has lived up to this promise and given individual employees a voice in how the union operates?
I do not. This union has been riddled with secrecy. They go to the bargaining table without discussing what they're doing with any of us. I was getting mixed messages about something that did happen at the bargaining table from multiple unions.
Will you pull that mic a little closer to you? There
Yes.
you go.
I was receiving conflicting messaging from union leaders about something that was going on in bargaining, and the union leaders said that anybody could come to the bargaining table. They wanted everybody to have a voice. So me and a few of my coworkers did attend the bargaining to observe what was going on, and we were not pleased with everything we were seeing, and we're discussing that with coworkers back in the store. And then the next time we went to observe the bargaining, they told us we couldn't be there. And when I asked why they had changed their mind on who could come to the bargaining, I asked the lawyer. They called hotel security on us to ask us to leave. We weren't disruptive at all. We were just there to observe what they had been doing. And they are not forthcoming with the information. They did not discuss the salaries they would be taking home. I found the financial documents on the Department of Labor website, and I asked people who are very close to the union leaders if they knew about the salaries that they'd be taking home, and they said, "What salaries?" And when I posted what these salaries were, the union president then said, nobody really cares about the salaries. This is a non-issue because we're not accepting dues. But I'm wondering why they think all the money that they're raising on representing us, they can just do whatever they want with.
Thank you very much. Mr. Delie, the United Auto Workers Union just lost an election at a Mercedes plant in Vance, Alabama. While the election was ongoing, media reports indicated the U.S. government may have reached out to pressure the German government regarding Mercedes' stance toward the election. Can you discuss what you know about this unusual action by the Biden administration?
Thank you, Dr. Fox. I'd be happy to. The reporting on this is still very fresh, so the details are still forthcoming. But Bloomberg has put forth a number of articles suggesting that someone in the Biden administration, perhaps DOL or some other entity, reached out to Germany specifically to discuss the organizing campaign, and that somehow resulted in an agreement between Germany and the United States to promote unionization. We also know that the European Council, which handles the European Union's international issues, has been involved in this as an investigation, and that now Germany has filed some degree of unfair labor practice charges. The details are still emerging, so it's hard to say for sure, but this would be extremely concerning if true, because you're putting essentially the full force of the federal government behind one side of a private labor dispute, and that would be significantly concerning for me.
Yeah, unfortunately, given the actions of this administration, it would not be too hard to believe the reports, because the actions of the administration has been in all cases to tip the scales in favor of the unions, and it's supposed to be neutral. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Dr. Fox. We'll now recognize Ms. Manning for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As we all know, this country is experiencing a historic swell in organizing, which has benefited thousands of workers across the country. In my own district, we have just seen workers at Thomas Built Buses secure a new contract which included significant raises and increased job security for the workers. And those are great workers who are proud to build energy-efficient electric school buses for school districts all across the country, thanks to the bipartisan infrastructure law, which we passed in the last Congress under President Biden's leadership. Thomas Built Buses have more orders than ever and are working hard to provide clean energy school buses that will help our environment. We've heard some interesting testimony today. I think we just heard a conspiracy theory, and we've heard some very negative testimony about the very existence of our labor laws, as well as accusations that unions are actually detrimental to employees and employers. Ms. Rhinehart, can you talk to us about benefits that the employers get with a unionized workforce?
Thank you. I'd be happy to. And a lot of what I'm going to say comes from a comprehensive report that the Department of Treasury put out last year on the importance of unions to building and maintaining a middle class in our country. That report goes into detail about the benefits that employers enjoy from having a unionized workforce, which include things like less turnover. Turnover and recruiting and replacing employees is very expensive, and unionized employers have less turnover because their employees tend to be more satisfied with their jobs and their working conditions and the fact that they have a voice. Unionized workers tend to be more productive than workers at non-union facilities, and so employers enjoy that advantage. And then they also get the advantage of having a way to engage employees collectively on issues that are facing the employer and the employees. So new technology, innovations at the plant, they have a way of organizing input to the employer on the issues that they're facing as they try to grow their businesses. So these are just a few of the advantages that unionized employers enjoy. I would add the morale issue, which comes about for many reasons, but one of them is that through having a union and a collective bargaining agreement, the rules covering the workplace, pay, and ground rules are all written up and they're transparent. So everybody knows what the rules of the game are, and that helps with employee morale because they know what the rules are and there's less arbitrary, random treatment in the workplace. So those are some of the advantages.
Thank you. And we all know that when employers don't pay a livable wage, families struggle to put food on the table, they struggle to pay their rent, they struggle to pay child care. So a livable wage, which unions are able to negotiate, helps us reduce dependence on government subsidies that some of my colleagues are so concerned about. Ms. Rhinehart, the courts have repeatedly upheld neutrality agreements. The NLRB has even upheld that national labor policy favors the honoring of voluntary agreements reached between employers and labor organizations, and that the board will enforce such agreements, including agreements that explicitly address matters involving union representation. Can you speak to why the courts and the NLRB have supported the use of neutrality agreements and find it consistent with the purpose of the National Labor Relations Act?
Absolutely. So voluntary recognition has been established practice since before we even had a National Labor Relations Act. It's a situation where employers voluntarily agree to recognize a union based on majority support and decide that they're not going to go through the whole elongated, prolonged NLRB election process, which can be very contentious and it can cause a whole lot of delay. I think the important things to point out about voluntary recognition are, one, that it's voluntary, so employers don't have to agree to it, and in fact, the NLRB's recent CEMEX decision, which has been characterized as mandating voluntary recognition, actually does no such thing. It says employers may voluntarily recognize, and they can choose not to, and they can file an election petition. It's their choice. It's voluntary. And fundamentally, the idea here is that employers are within their rights, and many choose to enter into a relationship, a collective bargaining relationship with their workers' representative more constructively and without a fight, because that starts them off on a better foot, and they can work collaboratively to grow their business and not have a fight.
Thank you. My time has expired. I yield back.
Thank you. We'll now recognize Mr. Burleson for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In reading the 2022 Gallup poll, it indicated most workers, after taking that poll, only 11% non-union employees described themselves as extremely interested in joining a union, and 58% said that they were not at all interested in joining a union. And when you add to the fact that 90% of people who are in a union have never even voted to be in the union that they're forced to pay dues to. You know, when I'm back home, I hear often from people who say that there was once a need that is less and less there for workers. Their unions were once served a great purpose has a diminishing role, and so I wonder if that's what's being reflected in these polls. Is it Delie?
Delie, Representative.
What are your thoughts on that? What's causing the diminishing desire to see a benefit or value in being a member of a union?
Well, I think there's a number of factors. For one, the legal environment that we're in has changed since the 1950s. There are significantly more regulations at both the state and federal level prohibiting all sorts of behaviors from safety to discriminatory practices that weren't in place back then. So I think that's one factor. But I think a larger factor is that the American worker has changed. Unions are still operating as though it's 1955, and Ford, GM, and now Stellantis own 80% of the auto industry, and that's just not the case. We are in a different economy. Workers want different things. They want the ability to make a choice freely and fairly and without interference, and they want that choice to be meaningful, but they also want independence and a direct relationship and workplace flexibility and work from home and a whole bunch of things that just aren't conducive to a one-size-fits-all approach to how you regulate a workplace.
And the once promise that that once you unionize, then everyone's salaries go up, you get better salaries, better benefits. That's not necessarily the case, is it? I mean, statistically, it's not necessarily the case.
No, I mean, I think when you look
at studies, sorry.
No, I apologize for interrupting. No, when you look at the data, you can't just take the average and assume that it applies equally across the states. $100,000 in California is very different than $100,000 in South Carolina. And so when you adjust for cost of living and various other factors, the evidence is largely inconclusive. There are some studies on one side that say there's a minor improvement. There are some studies on the other that say, no, it's actually a minor detriment. So I don't think this is a panacea where you can say, oh, all of a sudden you have unions and this creates a higher wage environment. I don't think that's accurate or borne out by the literature.
I know that in Missouri at one point there was a study that was done that was very intriguing because Missouri is surrounded by mostly states that are right to work. And when you compared the salaries of people that were living inside the border of Missouri compared to the counties that are just outside of the border, it was startling how much people actually make more money in the right to work states just across the border in Missouri. My other question has to do with people's decision and whether or not to join. Of course, in right to work states, often the argument is that they are receiving a benefit. That if they choose not to join the union, they're receiving some benefit. They're the free rider. I call it a captive rider situation. Can you talk about how the impact of the bill, the Workers' Choice Act, might impact that decision and actually benefit the workers?
Absolutely, and I'll try to be brief. So the issue that we have is one of exclusive representation. If I'm a dissenting employee in a unionized workplace, I can't negotiate my own terms and conditions of employment. On the union side, the argument is that's a free rider if I don't pay. I'm getting all of the contract benefits and I'm not paying anything. On the employee side, I'm a forced rider. I'm being forced to accept benefits and terms that I may not want and that I think I can do better. What Workers' Choice does is it eliminates that problem by saying, if you don't want to be part of a union, negotiate your own terms, and unions, you only have to represent those employees who are actually paying you. So it's a great solution to an age-old problem in labor law.
I think it's a fair thing all around. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. We'll now recognize Ms. Hayes for 5 minutes.
Thank you, and thank you to all of our witnesses for being here today. This is, again, the 5th hearing that this subcommittee has held to attack the rights of workers to organize and collectively bargain. While Americans are advocating for better wages, safer workplaces, and more secure retirements, this committee has focused our energy on unions and union members who make up less than 7% of the private sector workforce. The average union worker is paid about 20% more than the median non-union worker, is 26% more likely to be offered employer-sponsored health insurance, and up to 15% more likely to have paid leave. This does not mean that forming a union is right for every worker in every workplace. Mr. Delie, I happen to agree with you. That's why it's important for local workers to be able to weigh in on the conditions that they want to bargain for. Unionizing is a democratic process, and it's up to workers to decide by majority vote. It's interesting listening to all of my colleagues on this committee because every single one of us got here by the democratic process and a majority vote. We don't invalidate results if turnout is low. If people do not want a union, we want to protect the right for them to show up and vote no. But the idea that if a minority of employees vote, then the union should not exist, that's not how we're here. That's not how democratic processes work. Every worker deserves the opportunity to weigh in, and that's what, and tell us, and tell their employer what they think is best for themselves. However, many workers are not provided with a fair opportunity to consider the benefits or the drawbacks of unionizing because their employers take advantage of weak enforcement laws or pressure and punish them for organizing efforts. This year, the NLRB has opened 15 cases relating to unfair labor practices in my district, compared to only 3 cases for unions seeking representation last year. I'm a co-sponsor of the Protecting the Rights to Organize Act, which would provide greater clarity on the organizing process for workers and employers and ensure that workers and employees, and ensure that employers follow the law. I just also want to say that as representatives, once we are elected, we represent everybody, even the people who didn't vote for us. So the idea that not participating in the process invalidates it is incredibly problematic and not even something that we abide by here. Ms. Rhinehart, what tactics do unscrupulous employers use to undermine the agency of workers in an organizing drive? And how would the PRO Act ensure that workers can make these decisions free from employer interference?
Thank you for that question. Unfortunately, there's sort of a standard playbook that employers follow when they want to defeat an organizing drive. The first thing they do is fight the petition for a union election, if one has been filed before the National Labor Relations Board, and draw it out and litigate issues that really don't need to be litigating, and use the time that they buy to then run a campaign against the union. Kind of like what we saw down in Mercedes, captive audience meetings, a barrage of anti-union messages, bring in the supervisors to tell workers under their supervision that the boss doesn't want a union. That is standard playbook. Hire third-party anti-union union busters to come in and basically run the campaign. And these campaigns are very, very effective and really do deny workers a free and fair choice about whether to choose representation. However, workers still do vote to have a union. And in that instance, then sometimes you have a situation where an employer will drag out the bargaining process. We are seeing this with some major employers today, dragging out the bargaining process to try to basically undermine the union, discourage workers, and hope that somebody will file a decertification petition and get rid of the union. And the problem with all of this is that we really don't have adequate remedies under our labor law to address this conduct. If an employer illegally fires a worker for being pro-union, there are no penalties. There are no penalties against the employer for that act, and it takes forever for the case to get processed. And so under that legal regime, the law is just really too weak as it's currently drafted. And the Protecting the Right to Organize Act would address this situation by removing some of the employer interference from the election process, establishing real penalties when employers break the law, and providing a process for workers and unions and their employers to reach a first agreement when workers organize. So it would go a long way at leveling the playing field and making real workers' rights to organize.
Thank you. My time has expired, so I'll submit my next question, but I thought that hearing that whole and complete answer was very important to this process. With that, I yield back.
Thank you. We'll now recognize.
Ms. Rhinehart, first of all, thank you to all of our witnesses for being here today. The district that I represent, Pennsylvania's 7th district, which is known as the Lehigh Valley, home to the late, great Bethlehem Steel, has a rich history of organized labor. For over a century, unions have been the backbone of the American workforce, advocating for workers to have fair wages and safe working conditions and reasonable hours. My colleagues across the aisle claim that the balance of power favors unions, but that is simply an inaccurate claim. The law does not inherently favor unions. Rather, it attempts to strike a balance between the interests of workers and employers. Legislation such as the National Labor Relations Act, the NLRA, and the PRO Act, which I supported, aim to ensure fairness and stability in labor relations by providing guidelines for collective bargaining, protecting workers' rights to organize, and prohibiting unfair labor practices by both employers and unions. Ms. Rhinehart, research shows that 75% of employers force workers to attend captive audience meetings to listen to anti-union speeches by management. Can you confirm that, and can you tell us how this coercive tactic denies workers the ability to make independent decisions on unionizing?
Thank you. Yes, I can confirm that research shows that 75% of employers approximately conduct captive audience meetings, and something around that number also hire third-party union busters to come in and help them run their anti-union campaigns. And the problem with the captive audience meetings is that they are so coercive. They're on the employer's property, they're on work time, the employer runs the meetings, and employees get the message. They get the message loud and clear that their employer does not want them to unionize. And often, unfortunately, the conduct of captive audience meetings is accompanied with other conduct, such as firing or discriminating against pro-union workers.
And I assume these captive meetings don't include a balanced view where unions are invited in to also give a presentation.
Oh, no. Thank you for that clarification. The union has no ability to get inside the workplace and talk to workers about the benefits of unionization as a general matter. If they've reached a ground rule agreement with an employer to allow for some access, then that's an exception to the rule. But as a general matter, union organizers cannot come into the workplace and talk.
And so on that point, can you clarify whether unions truly have the same level of access to workers as employers do during organizing efforts?
I can clarify that unions absolutely do not have the same level of access to workers compared to employers.
Okay. And can you give us an idea of what the access is for unions to be able to talk to employees? How does that work?
Well, under our law, employers are allowed to keep out non-employees. And so if a union organizer is not an employee, they can't come into the workplace unless there's some public area in the workplace. And so they have to stand in the parking lot if the parking lot's open, or they have to stand on the street, literally on the street, to try to talk to workers as they come and go from work. So it's absolutely not equal, the access that employers and unions have to workers.
Great, thanks. And you know, a member of the majority, meaning my colleagues across the aisle, recently introduced the so-called Workers' Choice Act. Great title, sounds logical. In your testimony, though, you state that this bill would create chaos in the labor management system. Can you expand on that?
Yes. So in my view, the problem with the Workers' Choice Act is that it would undermine the collective bargaining system by which you have the union representing workers and the employer sitting at a table to negotiate over work rules for and pay and benefits for the entire workforce. If you have that, but individual workers are then allowed to opt out of that system and negotiate separately with the employer, it just creates a chaotic situation where the employer is having to deal with multiple entities. It opens the employer up to a risk of giving favorable treatment to some versus others, which might be illegal. It's going to open up all sorts of problems on the shop floor with people being worried about preferential treatment and favoritism.
So therein lies the chaos that you referred to, and correct. I guess it belies the term collective bargaining, the whole idea being bargaining on behalf of a collective or group of people. Is that fair to say?
That's exactly right. I'd also like to point out that under our labor law right now, there's nothing that prohibits an employer from dealing with a members-only union that is less than a majority of the workforce. If 20% of workers decide they want to be a members-only union, an employer can work with that union under current law, and they don't. And the reason they don't, I think, is because of this chaos point that we've just been talking about.
Thank you very much. With that, I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. And now I recognize my good friend from Virginia, Mr. Scott, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Rhinehart, we've heard about tipping the scales at the National Labor Relations Act. Is the National Labor Relations Act neutral about whether or not you should encourage joining unions?
The National Labor Relations Act encourages the practice of collective bargaining.
So the law itself is not neutral. The law itself encourages forming unions.
The law absolutely encourages the practice of collective bargaining. The law is also very clear that it's up to workers to choose, but the policy of the law is to encourage collective bargaining. It's not neutral on that point.
What does it say about the employer's right to influence the decision of the employees to join a union? And if they decide to join a union, which union to join? What is the employer's right to influence that decision in the National Labor Relations Act?
The National Labor Relations Act establishes that it's workers' choice. Employers are, under the law, allowed to express their opinion about unionization, which is where these captive audience meetings come in, where they express their opinion very clearly that they do not want a union, but they're not allowed to make threats against workers who are choosing to unionize.
Now, you mentioned penalties for firing workers and unfair labor practice. What is the penalty for, could you say again what the penalty is for illegally firing a worker who's trying to organize a union? It's zero.
There are no monetary penalties under the National Labor Relations Act for illegally firing workers, none.
The only thing that the employee would owe would be back wages minus what the employee could have earned outside.
That's correct. The National Labor Relations
Board
can impose.
If they get a job outside and make as much as they were making, there's nothing.
Then there's no back wages owed. There may be some related expenses. The NLRB came out with a decision a few months ago to make clear that they want, if workers have other expenses like the cost of buying health insurance while they were out of a job, that those costs can be recovered as well, but there's no penalties and there's no damages.
All that's after the fact, and the employer was able to send a mighty loud message to everybody else as to what happens.
Yes, it tends to undermine union organizing campaigns in a major way.
And there seemed to be a question about benefits of the union being inconclusive. Anything inconclusive about the value of joining a union in terms of salary?
Studies have repeatedly shown that unionized workers enjoy better pay, better benefits, better health and safety. I really am not familiar with the literature that suggests otherwise. Everything I've read is to the contrary.
That it's about 20% additional salary, more likely to get health benefits, more likely to get a pension.
Exactly. And I think it's also important to point out that non-union workers benefit from those union standards because employers raise wages to compete with unionized employers. So everybody benefits.
And you've seen this in the union elections in Mercedes where they were increasing the pay to try to avoid the union.
And eliminating 2 tiers, which was another key issue of workers. And they did it really, I think, in response to what the UAW accomplished in the negotiations last fall.
The gentlelady from Connecticut, Ms. Hayes, mentioned the fact that we're elected many times with the minority of the people voting for us. Yesterday, I understand that in a special election in California, the winner is going to come to Congress with less than about 10% of the population of his district voting for him, and he will be welcomed in Congress just like everybody else. Let me ask you a quick question on salts. How do you tell under this legislation, how would you tell an illegal salt from somebody who just supports unions?
That's a great question. I don't know. I guess the employer would have to interrogate the worker.
You discriminate first and ask questions later.
Discriminate first and ask questions later. I think that's right.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Scott. We'll now recognize the ranking member for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Rhinehart, the neutrality agreements, Microsoft, 100,000 people were affected. Tell me a little bit more about that. Why are so many high road employers? And what I mean by that expression, are people who are both union employers and non-union employers who pay competitive wages and benefits, pay their taxes, and bring the country up altogether, union and non-union. So in this instance, a company like Microsoft applying a Neutrality Act to negotiations for 100,000 affected people. Tell me more about that. And then in the context of some of your other comments today about whether Americans want to be in unions or not, or Mr. Alcorn, I'm sorry to hear your story. Of course, there are hundreds of stories that could be told on both sides of that. I will take your story at face value, and it upsets me as a pro-union person when people start to bend the rules on either side too much. Elections do have sharp elbows involved, but we try to comply with the law. So neutrality acts go ahead of that, go back to the culture of what's good for the employer is good for the American people, not just what's good for the General Motors corporate executives.
Thank you, Congressman. I really think it's important to always keep in mind that neutrality agreements and voluntary recognition agreements are voluntary and elective on the part of employers, and they enter into them for business reasons. And the business reasons could be that they're reading and hearing about the benefits of having a unionized workforce, about having their workers having a collective voice on the issues that matter to them. Employers are probably reading the polls and seeing that there's increased interest in organizing, that young workers want unions, they want to have a collective voice and have some input, and that perhaps it's in their business interest to listen to that and provide a process for workers to choose fairly whether or not to have representation and not get into a fight. I think those are some of the reasons that go into businesses deciding to enter into neutrality agreements, is that they're just realizing that workers want to have a collective voice and that in their business interest, they'd like to just accept that and move on that and not get into a fight.
Just on a macro level, and I know the chairman's sick of me talking about me about John Kenneth Galbraith and Thomas Piketty, but Galbraith said there should be countervailing institutions, political institutions would be my word, between wages and capital. Piketty talked, fairly agnostically from my perspective, of the history of when capitalistic societies get too one way or the other. Right now we're a big diversity, not that capital's wrong, but the discrepancy between the balance between wages goes to the question about, do unions help that? Galbraith argued that you needed unions as a countervailing institution to capital. Could you speak to that a little bit, which goes to Mr. Delie's question about going back to the 50s, which I respectfully disagree with. He's also sick of me quoting Eisenhower about only a fool would stop an American worker from trying to organize. But could you speak to that a little bit?
Sure, and I have to say I was confused by the comments about workers running away from unions because the evidence is absolutely to the contrary. Union membership is up 200,000 for each of the last 2 years. It's up, not down. And petitions for union representation elections are up this year by 35% at the National Labor Relations Board. That tells us that workers want unions. And I think that some of what's going on here is that workers are tuned into what you have pointed out, the discrepancy between their pay and CEO pay. And they're feeling like they should get a little bit more of the pie in their own pockets to help meet their needs. We saw this in the negotiations last fall with the big three automakers, where the automakers were making tons of money and the CEOs were making tons of money, and the workers were really demanding a much larger share of the pie for themselves and for their livelihoods. And they were able to win very important raises through the bargaining process.
And then what happened to other Japanese companies, I can't remember, was Toyota, Honda, that didn't have union representation? What did they do after the UAW's action?
Yeah, interestingly, they raised pay significantly for their workers.
Which seems intuitively that shows that the union movement specifically in that instance helped non-union people, which I would argue as a customer of Trader Joe's, that also happened, that the people work there, they like the environment, they're non-union, but they could go to work at Safeway.
Exactly.
Thanks, I yield back.
Thank you. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes. Appreciate our witnesses enduring with us through the process here. We're almost finished. Mr. Messenger, as we've discussed today, labor unions often force employers to sign a contract requiring the employer not to interfere with the union's attempts to organize. The Democrats' position, as demonstrated by their holy grail, the PRO Act, is embrace a union or close your doors. These so-called neutrality agreements handcuff employers while the unions get free rein to prey upon the employees. And as you know, a key provision of many neutrality agreements is the gag rule that prohibits the employer from saying anything negative about the union before an election, even though a union may end up ultimately destroying the company. Can you discuss, again, the role that employers should be able to play before a unionization vote's taken?
Yes, the National Labor Relations Act favors robust, uninhibited debate about unionization. Congress actually enacted Section 8C of the NLRA just to facilitate and foster that kind of debate. So employees can hear both sides of the issue when they make their decision, preferably in a voting booth. Gag clauses, of course, deprive employees of both sides of the story about unionization and therefore hinder their ability to make an informed choice.
What about any free speech concerns with the restrictions that are placed on employers?
Well, the gag clause generally prohibit employers from saying anything about unionization or the union. In fact, in some organizing agreements, the gag clauses require that the employer see something favorable about the union to try to encourage the employees to unionize, which sometimes is sort of difficult to accept because usually employers are coerced to enter into these agreements. So they're coerced into saying something that they don't even believe.
Another component of the neutrality agreements requires the employers to give the unions access to their business property and share the private contact information with the employees. How does this, again, facilitate intimidation by union bosses or union organizers of the employees?
Sure, the personal information about employees, besides being a breach of their privacy to hand over to a third-party special interest, email addresses, personal cell phone numbers, and the rest, facilitate home visits. Union organizers can go to individuals' homes over and over and over again to try to get them to sign union cards. And then with respect to access to the workplace, it creates quite an impression on employees when all of a sudden the union is camped out in their break room, and it creates the impression that the employer wants you to do this by the fact that the union is there with the blessing of the employer.
You, I'm sure, are aware, but my bill, H.R. 719, amends the Management Relations Act to make it unlawful for employers to provide any organizing assistance to labor unions, which would effectively end the practice of neutrality agreements. How do you think that my bill might help true employer-union-employee dialogue and debate in labor disputes?
Well, the bill would make clear that organizing assistance is a thing of value under Section 302. So Section 302 makes it unlawful for a union to demand or receive any money or other thing of value to a union. The bill, again, makes clear organizing assistance can be a thing of value to a union. Now, right now, there's a circuit split over that issue. 11th Circuit says it is, 4th and 3rd Circuit says it's not. Now, my position is it's already a thing of value. There is no organizing exemption to Section 302. But again, there's a circuit split on this issue, and your bill would very helpfully resolve that split and make clear there is no organizing exemption to Section 302, and then it is unlawful for an employer to give things of value to a union that are valuable for organizing, such as a gag clause, which is really just control over the employer's speech, information about employees, access to the workplace, and other things.
Thank you. There's been a lot of stats thrown around today, but despite the great lengths the Biden administration has gone to promote and support big labor, the Bureau of Labor Statistics shows private sector union membership is at an all-time low of 6%, something that Ms. Hayes, by the way, agreed with. A 2022 Gallup poll found that more than 58% of Americans not currently in a union have no interest in joining one. More than 90% of workers represented by a union under the NLRA today never voted for the union that represents them. In 2015, unions represented 8 million private sector workers under the NLRA, and just under 500,000 of those, or about 6%, ever voted for union representation at any point in their careers and were still employed by the company in which they voted for the union. The remaining 94% either voted against the union, opted not to vote in the election, or more commonly inherited the union previously certified as the exclusive representative. In a 2022 Gallup poll, non-union workers reported, and this does not surprise me after working in an auto factory with a union, but non-union workers reported being more engaged, enthusiastic about their work and their workplace than union members. On the other hand, about 24% of union members reported being actively disengaged, unhappy, and resentful that their work needs were not being met. So with that, I will yield the remainder of my time and ask the ranking member to give his closing statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's a fascinating conversation. Louis Brandeis once said that we can have concentration of great wealth in the hands of very few Americans, or we can have democracy. We can't have both. I would argue the latter has happened. The funding for our campaigns, presidential campaigns, and Citizens United is disproportionately towards people who have accumulated lots of capital and use it for their own ends. And a lot of them believe, quite honestly, that average people are not smart enough or capable enough to have free and fair elections and be engaged, whether it's in a union election, a city council election, or a presidential election. We hear people right now, running up to this next presidential election, saying that duly certified, proven through the courts presidential election was fake, wasn't accurate. Somehow we've gotten this view that you can be as greedy as you want to be, and that's okay, at the sacrifice, in my view, of working people. And I believe that average people can govern, but they're at a disadvantage. And to Galbert's observation, unions and organizing give average people a voice. They are not perfect. They are human institutions. So unfortunately, sometimes people don't do things that we'd like humans to do perfectly in organizing. But disproportionately, I would argue that corporate interests have now broken the laws that used to be in effect when the CEOs made 3 times what their average worker, as opposed to 400 times, which is the world we live in right now. This is a good conversation. We have to stick by the letter of the law. People bend the law. But we also have to be mindful of what this country's about. It's about merit, hard work, and people being able to get their fair share. And right now we don't have that because the concentration of wealth is very disproportionate. And even conservative economists warn about that concentration of wealth. The way to get at that from a political instance is to give workers voices. And it's pretty clear to me that the union movement historically has done that. And not to dismiss the 50s or to go back to the 1860s, there are institutions in this country that have wanted cheap labor. That's the way it's been. But we've had a fight throughout our time to recognize individual choice and merit, but also and recognize that unfortunately human nature being what it is, that some people decide that their interests are everyone's interest. Unions are what represent everyone's interest as a political entity, as an economic entity. And that's why it's important that we give them the strongest voice legally that we can, which is working through the current system. And respectively, we have a very different perspective on that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, and I thank our witnesses for sharing today. The fact is, unions are contrary to a strong economy. They cause inflated, non-competitive wages, massive cost increases, lower productivity. They cultivate anti-employer or anti-management attitudes, very unhealthy workplace environment. They protect unproductive workers, or worse. In short, the value of unions have long expired with long-past legislation that corrected former poor working conditions. Healthy competitive market pressures and American culture make unions unnecessary at best and truly harmful at worst. The ranking member was correct, to paraphrase his opening remarks. Employees don't have to fight their employers tooth and nail. But that's what unions tell them they need to do, and they should work together for their shared mutual interests. My union experience working in an auto factory was more similar to that of Mr. Alcorn, by the way. And unions have long outlived their usefulness, and Americans overwhelmingly agree, as only 6% of those in the private sector, again, are part of a union. And according to a Gallup poll, only 11% of non-union employees describes themselves as, quote, extremely interested in joining a union. 58%, on the other hand, said they're not interested at all. So that makes it 5 times as many non-union employees who are strongly against a union versus a number who are strongly for a union. That's why we have the lowest unionization numbers today, because this isn't the work environment of the 1930s. Employers today have more laws and regulations governing what they do than ever before. Employees have more choices, flexibility, and benefits than ever before. While we can continue to work to improve opportunities and conditions for workers today, we don't need to cling to yesteryear, and we certainly shouldn't tolerate deceptive union tactics that undermine workers' choice. We cannot allow big labor to continue their despicable practices that harm employers and undermine employee rights. It's wrong to pit workers and employers against each other. Republicans have actual legislative solutions. My legislation to end neutrality agreements, Representative Owen's SALT Act to expose workers who are only there to stir up trouble, and Representative Burleson's Workers' Choice Act, which promotes the right to work. So I hope our committee can continue to advance these policies that will protect workers, and without objection, there being no further business, the subcommittee stands adjourned.